They gathered that day in what was meant to be a union of two souls. The chandeliers sparkled, violins hummed, and every guest swore they had never seen a bride glow with such beauty. Amara, radiant in white, had her entire future written across her smile. And Daniel, the man she believed she knew better than anyone, stood at the altar with steady hands and rehearsed promises. But behind the glass of champagne and the glimmer of expensive rings, shadows had already gathered, the kind of shadows that do not show themselves until the very moment they strike. This wedding, dressed in silk and crowned with applause, was already collapsing under the weight of secrets that could no longer be hidden. For months, Amara believed in Daniel's charm. He had been her rescuer, her lover, her supposed safe place. He told her she was his forever, but forever can end in a single night. Selina, the one no one suspected, stood only steps away, her gaze lingering not on her fiancé Kelvin, but on Daniel, the groom himself, and though no guest dared to voice it, her silence was not the silence of innocence. It was the silence of someone who knew her role in a betrayal so deep it would bring this hall to ruins. Think for a moment. What if you were Amara, smiling before a crowd, while the man you trusted and the woman who should have been like a sister to you exchanged glances no vow could ever erase? Before I tell you what happened when the truth erupted, I need you to do something. Tell me in the comments. Where are you watching this from? Don't stay quiet. The guests at this wedding stayed silent, and that silence made the destruction so much worse. The music played louder that morning, but Amara's heart noticed the small fractures. Daniel's eyes darting towards Selina. Kelvin, his best friend, shifting uneasily without knowing why. People think betrayal announces itself with thunder, but sometimes it is a whisper, a look, a touch too long. The night before, Amara had received a message she could not explain. 3 words glowing on her phone screen. Ask about Selina. She wanted to dismiss it, to believe it was a cruel prank. But the unease remained, and in that unease, the truth was waiting. She did not know that Daniel had already crossed lines that could never be redrawn. She did not know that the man who had promised her honesty had been walking into hidden meetings, stolen hours, and secret touches with the very woman who would stand in front of her on this day. The betrayal was not coming. It had already happened. And soon, the guests, the families, and the entire hall would see it with their own eyes. But let me ask you this. If you discovered a betrayal unfolding on the very day meant to seal your future, would you walk away, or would you fight back in front of everyone? Comment below, because Amara had to decide, not in the silence of her room, but under the eyes of the world. And as the violins played and the vows were about to be spoken, one truth threatened to burn through the silk curtains of this perfect stage. Daniel was not the groom everyone thought he was. Selina was not the loyal fiancée everyone admired. And Amara, she was about to show the world that silence would no longer protect the guilty. The guests leaned forward, unaware that they were not witnesses to a celebration, but spectators at the edge of disaster. The strings of the violins swelled, echoing against marble walls, but beneath the music, a current of unease ran deep. No one could name it yet, but they felt it. Some turned their heads when Daniel's eyes lingered too long on Selina. Others whispered when Amara's smile faltered ever so slightly, though she quickly masked it with practiced grace. But the truth has a way of pushing through the smallest cracks. As Amara reached the altar, her hand steady though her heart beat unevenly, she noticed it again. Daniel's nervous glance, not toward her, but toward the woman standing at Kelvin's side. Selina did not flinch. She held her composure like a mask carved from stone, her beauty untouched by guilt, her silence louder than any denial. Kelvin, poor Kelvin, adjusted his tie, unaware that he was already the fool in this gathering. For weeks, he had ignored signs, Selina's late-night absences, the way her laughter returned after private calls. the perfume she wore home that was not the one he had given her. But in love, blindness feels safer than truth. And so he remained blind, until this very moment when his world prepared to collapse. Amara's father shifted in his seat, uneasy, sensing that something was off. He had warned her once, told her that Daniel's charm was too polished, his stories too rehearsed, his devotion too convenient. But Amara had defended him, believed him, built her future on him. And now she was about to learn that a man who builds love on deception does not build at all. He only borrows time until the lies consume him. But let me pause to ask you something. If you stood at an altar, ready to promise forever, and felt your partner's heart reaching for someone else, would you still speak the vows? Or would you stop everything, even as the eyes of the world bore down on you? Answer me in the comments, because Amara had no more time to choose. The priest cleared his throat, opening the sacred words that would bind bride and groom, and as he did, Daniel's hand trembled, not from fear of commitment, no, but from the weight of being exposed. For somewhere among the crowd, a message had been passed, a whisper carried from one guest to another, a truth that would not remain hidden. Daniel and Selina had been seen together, long before this day, in places no groom and no fiancé should ever be. The silence stretched. The priest's words blurred as Amara's eyes locked on Daniel. She could see it now. Not just doubt, but guilt. The kind of guilt that seeps into every gesture, every breath. The kind of guilt that no amount of smiling photographs or carefully staged kisses could erase. Her grip on the bouquet tightened. She remembered the message from the night before. Ask about Selina. Now she understood. It was not a prank. It was not the work of a jealous stranger. It was a warning. Selina's lips curved, not into a smile, but into something far more dangerous. A smirk too fleeting for others to notice, but long enough for Amara to catch. And in that instant, Amara's entire world collapsed. The betrayal was real, and it was standing before her, dressed in silk and roses. But this story did not end in silence. Amara was not the kind of woman to swallow her pain behind closed doors. Not today, not when the world watched. She turned, facing the sea of guests. The hall fell into an uneasy quiet. The violinist faltered, the bow dragging across strings with an aching squeal. Amara lifted her chin, and with a voice steady but trembling at its edges, she spoke not just to Daniel, not just to Selina, but to everyone who had gathered in false celebration. The confession spilled into the room like fire catching dry leaves. Faces turned. Gasps echoed. Kelvin froze, his jaw slack as his eyes darted from his bride-to-be to his best friend. And in that single moment, reputations shattered, alliances fractured, futures disintegrated. But here is where you must listen carefully. Betrayal, once spoken aloud, cannot be contained. It spreads like smoke, choking every corner it touches. The families leapt into argument, voices overlapping with rage, disbelief, and shame. Daniel stammered, his perfect mask dissolving. Selina, calm in the eye of the storm, watched without apology. And Amara, she stood tall, her pain no longer hidden. I'll ask you again, if you were her, with every eye watching, with your heart torn apart by betrayal, would you stay silent to protect appearances? Or would you expose the truth, no matter the cost? Tell me, because Amara chose the second path. And in choosing it, she set in motion a chain of events that no one in that hall could stop. The hall shook with voices, the air thick with disbelief. Guests who had come to witness love now found themselves witnesses to destruction. Chairs scraped against marble as families rose, each taking sides in a war that had begun long before this day, but was only now dragged into the light. Daniel, stripped of his polished smile, tried to speak, but his words stumbled into stutters, his excuses drowned by the roar of the crowd. He reached for Amara, but she recoiled, her veil trembling as she stepped back. Her silence was louder than his pleas. Kelvin's face darkened as he turned on Selina. He demanded answers, demanded denial, demanded anything to erase the truth he had just heard. But Selina gave none. Her lips remained sealed, her eyes unblinking, her calm almost cruel. She did not defend herself. She did not defend Daniel. She simply stood, watching, as though betrayal was not shame, but power. The guests erupted again, some shouting at Daniel, others whispering about Selina. A few tried to calm Amara, but she refused comfort. She stood with a strength carved from heartbreak, her words cutting sharper than glass. And then the chaos spilled into violence. Kelvin lunged forward, his fury uncontrollable. His fists clenched, his voice trembling with rage. He called Daniel a traitor, a thief, a brother who had destroyed the bond they shared. Security rushed in, black suits weaving through guests, hands outstretched to keep the peace. But in the confusion, one mistake sealed the next twist. They grabbed Kelvin, not Daniel. They seized the man whose world had been shattered, whose fury was raw, while the true betrayer stood untouched. The hall gasped. "Why him?" someone cried. "It's not Kelvin, it's Daniel who deserves this." But their voices were drowned out by the struggle, Kelvin shouting as he was pulled toward the exit. And Daniel? He stood in the center of it all, chest heaving, yet untouched, his guilt shielded by the chaos around him. Think about that for a moment. The guilty left standing, while the betrayed is dragged away. How many times in life does the innocent suffer while the deceiver walks free? It is not justice, it is not fairness. Yet it happens, again and again and again. Tell me, if you saw your best friend betray you, would you lose control like Kelvin, or would you stand silent, swallowing the pain? Comment below, because silence in this moment was more dangerous than rage. The doors closed behind Kelvin, his cries echoing down the hall. Amara's knees weakened, but she refused to collapse. She lifted her face to the crowd, her voice steady, filled with the strength of a woman who had nothing left to lose. "Now you see," she declared, her words striking the room into silence, "what kind of man Daniel truly is." A hush fell over the hall. Even the musicians set down their instruments. Every eye turned toward Daniel, and in that silence, the weight of his betrayal could no longer be hidden. He looked from face to face, desperate for support, but none came. Even his own family turned their heads, ashamed to meet his gaze. Selina, however, did not waver. She met Amara's eyes with an expression cold as ice. She seemed almost victorious, as though the collapse of two lives was not tragedy, but triumph. But this was not the end. Not yet. For the aftermath of betrayal is not simply exposure, it is fallout, a chain of consequences that spreads far beyond the moment of truth. Business partners would withdraw, families would fracture, friends would turn to enemies, and all of it because one man and one woman chose selfishness over loyalty. And here is where you must listen closely. Betrayal does not only wound the heart, it poisons everything it touches. The hall no longer looked like a wedding, it looked like a battlefield dressed in flowers. The scent of roses mixed with sweat and fear, and the beauty that had been built for this day, now stood as a cruel disguise for ruin. Amara did not collapse. She refused to. Betrayal had broken her heart, but it had also carved steel into her spine. She stood in her gown, no longer a bride, but a witness, exposing truth before a crowd that could no longer deny it. Daniel, desperate, reached for her again, his words fumbling, promises tumbling from his lips like shards of glass. "It was a mistake," he pleaded, but the words meant nothing. The faces around him told the story better than his excuses. Guests looked at him with disgust, with pity, with anger. Not one looked at him with forgiveness. His own mother turned her face away, pressing her hands to her chest as tears streamed down. His father muttered beneath his breath, shame etching lines deeper into his face. Families who had once spoken of alliances and futures now spoke only of disgrace. Kelvin's absence burned like an open wound. The friend who had stood by him through youth, who had trusted him with everything, was now dragged out like a criminal while Daniel remained. And that injustice, that imbalance, tore the crowd apart. Half the hall cried for Kelvin to be brought back. The other half shouted for Daniel to be removed. Voices clashed, accusations flew, and what began as whispers of betrayal became a storm of division. Selina stood unmoved. Her silence was no longer silence. It was defiance. She did not hide. She did not apologize. And for those who looked closely, her eyes revealed no guilt. Instead, they carried something more dangerous: satisfaction. She had taken what was never hers, and she stood proud in the ashes of what she had destroyed. And Amara saw it. The smirk she had caught earlier returned, fleeting but undeniable. It was not just betrayal. It was intentional. It was calculated. Amara's bouquet slipped from her hands and hit the floor with a dull thud. The sound echoed louder than applause, louder than music. It was the sound of endings. The flowers scattered across marble, petals torn as though mirroring her own heart. But she did not cry. Not anymore. Her tears had dried, and what remained was strength. She raised her voice, trembling but clear, so that no one could mistake her words. "This wedding is over," she declared, "and so is the man you all believed in." The hall froze. Some gasped, others nodded. But no one spoke against her. Her courage was a mirror that reflected their own silence, their own guilt in ignoring the signs. And here is where I ask you again. If it were you standing before hundreds, would you have the strength to say those words? Would you risk humiliation to expose truth? Or would you hide behind silence, pretending everything was fine? Answer me in the comments, because silence is how betrayal thrives. The musicians packed their instruments. The guests began to move, murmurs rising like smoke from a fire. Business partners whispered of canceled deals, friends whispered of broken trust, and the families who had hoped for unity now braced for war. Amara turned away from Daniel, no longer seeing him as the man she once loved, but as a stranger. Every memory, every promise, every kiss, every whispered word now felt poisoned. She could not tell where the lies ended and the truth began. And that is the cruelty of betrayal. It does not only wound the present, it rewrites the past. Daniel stood alone, surrounded yet abandoned. He looked to Selina, but she gave him nothing. Not comfort, not solidarity. Only the cold stare of a woman who had gained what she wanted, even if it meant his ruin. The celebration had ended, but the consequences had only just begun. For betrayal does not stop when it is revealed. It lingers, it festers, it spreads into every relationship, every decision, every future plan, and in this hall, everyone would carry the scars of this day. Remember this: trust is fragile, and once broken, it is not only the guilty who fall, it is everyone connected to them. The hall emptied slowly, like a storm dispersing, but leaving destruction in its wake. The petals from Amara's bouquet lay crushed beneath hurried footsteps, trampled just as her trust had been. Conversations that once brimmed with joy now carried only fragments of shock and disgust. Outside, the night air was heavy. Guests whispered in clusters, their voices hushed but urgent, as though speaking too loudly would make them complicit in the ruin they had witnessed. Phones buzzed, messages flew. In minutes, the story escaped the walls of the reception hall and began spreading across the city. By dawn, it would travel even further. Betrayal never stays contained. It seeks ears, it seeks mouths, and it feeds on gossip until it grows larger than the truth itself. Daniel remained behind, abandoned in the wreckage of his own choices. He sat slumped at the edge of the altar, his tie loosened, his face pale. The man who once commanded admiration now looked smaller, weaker, stripped of the illusion he had built. He muttered to himself, words no one cared to hear, excuses, apologies, none of them mattered any more. Selina, however, left without haste. She did not run, nor did she hide her face. She walked with measured steps, her head held high, as though she had not just been exposed, but had in fact won. And perhaps, in her mind, she had. For some people find power not in love, but in the destruction of others. Kelvin's voice echoed faintly from outside, still restrained by those who had dragged him away. His anger had not cooled, and it would not cool for years. For what Daniel had taken was more than friendship. It was brotherhood. It was trust. And that trust would never return. Amara stood apart from them all, alone, but not broken. Her dress no longer gleamed as it had that morning. It was stained by dust, by spilled wine, by the day's unraveling. But still, she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who refused to be defined by betrayal. And this is where the cruelest question settles. What now? For some, betrayal sparks rage. For others, it sparks silence. But for Amara, it offered a choice. Would she let this day consume her? Or would she rise from it, scarred but unshaken? The guests had made their decision already. By the next morning, their voices would spread stories in coffee shops, offices, and living rooms. They would speak of the wedding where love collapsed before their eyes. They would argue over who was most guilty, over who deserved pity, over who would never recover. And yet none of them bore the true pain. That weight belonged to Amara alone. Daniel would be remembered, yes, but not as a groom. He would be remembered as a warning. Selina would be remembered too, not as a fiancée, but as a thief of trust. And Kelvin, dragged from the hall in anger, would be remembered as a man who fought too late. But Amara? Her name would carry differently. For some, she would be the woman abandoned, betrayed, humiliated. For others, she would be the woman who stood tall, who exposed the truth instead of living a lie, which she would become depended on the choice she made next. And so I ask you now, if you were in her place, what would you do? Would you forgive the unforgivable? Would you vanish into silence, letting time erase the whispers? Or would you take your pain and sharpen it into something greater, something that ensured no one could ever wound you again? Tell me in the comments, because her decision was not the end of a wedding. It was the beginning of a transformation. The night ended with no celebration, no laughter, no music. Only silence. A silence heavier than sound. But inside that silence, Amara's heart burned with a new fire. She had lost the man she thought she loved. But perhaps in that loss, she had found something else, the strength to rebuild, not with Daniel at her side, not with Selina lurking behind, but on her own. They say no betrayal is born in a single moment. It is cultivated quietly, like weeds beneath the soil, growing stronger while everyone else admires the flowers above. What Amara witnessed on her wedding day was not an accident. It was the end of something that had begun long before she ever put on her gown. It started innocently enough, years earlier, when Daniel reconnected with Selina at a friend's party. At first it seemed harmless. Two people with shared memories laughing over old stories. They exchanged numbers under the excuse of catching up. And though Amara noticed, she brushed it aside. After all, trust was the foundation of love, or so she believed, but trust can blind as easily as it protects. The late-night calls began. They were disguised as work conversations, business discussions that Daniel insisted were important. Amara, tired from long days of planning their future, often fell asleep before he came to bed, and in those hours he built another world, one where Selina was the only voice he wanted to hear. There were lunches that turned into dinners, dinners that turned into excuses, excuses that became lies, and the lies, like drops of water, hollowed the stone of Amara's faith until cracks began to form. Kelvin saw it before she did. He had known Daniel since boyhood, had shared secrets with him long before Selina came into the picture, and he recognized the change, the evasive glances, the nervous shifting, the guilt that lingered on Daniel's face after every conversation with Selina. Kelvin warned him, more than once. He pleaded, "Don't destroy the one woman who truly loves you." But temptation has a way of silencing reason. The meetings continued. Hotel rooms became hiding places. The same hands that Amara thought would lift her veil on her wedding day were already tangled in another woman's hair. And while Amara measured fabric for her bridal dress, while she rehearsed vows she meant with every beat of her heart, Selina rehearsed a different script, one where she would stand at the center, where Amara's place would be stolen, where the spotlight would shift. And still, no one told Amara the truth. Not her friends, who suspected but did not dare confront. Not her family, who thought speaking up might destroy the engagement. And not even Kelvin, though he wanted to. For by the time he gathered the courage, it was already too late. The betrayal had been set in motion. On the night before the wedding, Daniel and Selina met one last time. Perhaps it was guilt that drove him there. Perhaps it was fear of commitment. He promised her it was the end, that once he married Amara, everything would stop. But promises made in darkness are rarely kept in light. And as fate would have it, that final meeting became the very noose that strangled him at the altar. The story you witnessed in the hall was not just a collapse. It was an unveiling. The mask finally torn away after months of deception. And Amara? She had been standing in the middle of this storm the entire time, never knowing the clouds were already overhead. This is where betrayal cuts deepest, not in the act itself, but in the discovery that the signs were there all along. The unanswered calls, the subtle avoidance, the change in tone. And still she had believed. Still she had trusted. Still she had hoped. Now hope was gone. Let me ask you, if someone close to you had seen the signs, should they have told Amara? Or should they have stayed silent, believing it was not their place? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because silence can protect, but it can also destroy. The hall was silent now. Guests who had once cheered for love stood frozen in disbelief, their whispers echoing through the chandeliers. The music had stopped, the laughter had died, and there, at the center of it all, Amara stood, her veil torn, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the man she thought she knew. Daniel avoided her gaze. His face, once so confident, was pale. He tried to speak, but his words fell apart before they could form. And Selina, standing a step behind him, wore a look that hovered between shame and defiance. But Amara said nothing. Her silence was louder than any scream. She turned slowly, her gown dragging across the marble floor, and every eye followed her. Some guests called her name, others reached for her arm, but she walked past them all, steady and deliberate, as though carrying an invisible weight no one else could bear. Out in the night air she finally stopped. The wind caught her veil and tore it from her hair, carrying it across the pavement like a ghost. She watched it drift away, and with it, something inside her drifted too, the last piece of innocence she would ever hold. But the story did not end with her leaving that hall. What no one expected was how quickly whispers would spread. Within hours, photos and videos were online. Strangers across the city were replaying her pain, dissecting her humiliation frame by frame. Her name became a headline. Her heartbreak, a spectacle. And yet, somewhere in the shadows of her grief, a different fire was being kindled. She replayed the night in her mind over and over, Daniel's stammering, Selina's smirk, the gasps of her guests. And each time she replayed it, her pain turned sharper, clearer, harder. It was no longer the fragile ache of heartbreak. It was something heavier, something that whispered, "This will not be the end of me." Kelvin saw it first. Days later, when he visited her, he noticed the change in her eyes. There was no longer just sorrow. There was resolve. Amara was no longer the bride abandoned. She was becoming something else entirely. And though Daniel thought his betrayal had ended her, he was about to learn that it had only awakened her. For betrayal has two endings, one where the betrayed breaks, and one where they rise. Amara chose the latter. Have you ever seen someone rise stronger after being broken? Do you believe heartbreak makes people tougher, or does it change them forever? Let me know in the comments, because sometimes the deepest wounds carve the sharpest strength. The days after the wedding felt endless. Amara locked herself away, curtains drawn, untouched meals left cold on the table. To the world, she seemed broken. Her friends whispered that she might never recover, that she would fade into silence and shame. But behind those closed doors, something else was happening. Each sleepless night became a battlefield of memories. She replayed Daniel's betrayal until the images no longer pierced her. They hardened her. She stared into the mirror until her tears dried into something colder, sharper, until her reflection no longer looked like a woman abandoned, but like a woman reborn. She began to write, not letters of sorrow, but lists, plans, strategies, notes that connected every piece of what had happened. Daniel's deception, Selina's intrusion, the guests who watched in silence. She drew maps of faces and motives. She wanted to understand not only how she had been betrayed, but why. And slowly she began to see what others missed. Daniel was not just a man weak in desire, he was a man tied to greed. His business dealings were fragile, built on debts and secrets. And Selina, she was not just a woman chasing love, she was chasing position, status, the power that came with being by Daniel's side. The betrayal was not random, it was calculated. And so, Amara decided her revenge would not be loud, not immediate, not impulsive. It would be patient, it would be precise. It would strike them where they least expected, not in their hearts, but in the very foundations of what they thought they owned. Kelvin became her silent witness. He noticed the files she gathered, the calls she began to make, the way she carried herself now, no longer trembling, no longer unsure. She carried the stillness of someone waiting for the right moment to strike. Weeks turned into months. Daniel and Selina carried on with their lives as though nothing had happened. To the public, they appeared powerful, united, unstoppable. But in the shadows, Amara watched. She was not gone. She was not defeated. She was waiting. And when her moment came, she would not simply return to confront them. She would dismantle everything they had built together, piece by piece. But here lies the question that lingers for us all. When betrayal births revenge, does it heal the wound? Or does it create something darker that can never be undone? If you were in Amara's place, would you walk away and start over? Or would you wait, watch, and strike back when they least expected it? Comment your answer below. I want to know what kind of strength you believe in. Months passed. On the surface, life in the city moved forward. The whispers of the wedding scandal had quieted, replaced by new gossip, new distractions. Daniel and Selina had grown bold, appearing at galas, laughing in photographs, their arms linked as if nothing had ever fractured them. But Amara watched from a distance, her silence sharper than any words she could have spoken. She knew something they did not. Pride makes even the clever careless. Daniel's new ventures, risky real estate projects, business deals sealed with handshakes instead of contracts, were stretched thin. He flaunted wealth, but behind the curtain, debts loomed like shadows. He needed credibility, partnerships, investors, and Selina, desperate to prove her worth, helped him secure them. This was where Amara struck first. It began with a letter, anonymous, typed, not handwritten, sent not to Daniel but to one of his largest investors. Inside, a single sheet, a list of debts Daniel had hidden, names of men he owed, figures that did not add up. No threats, no explanation, just cold facts. The investor pulled away within days, spooked by the numbers. A small crack, but enough for others to notice. Whispers spread, questions arose, and though Daniel dismissed it publicly with his usual charm, behind closed doors, his voice grew sharp, his temper short. Amara smiled for the first time in months, but she was not done. Her second move came quietly. At an event Selina had planned, a charity gala meant to polish their image, photographs appeared in the press, photographs no one could explain. Images of Selina, weeks before the wedding, entering Daniel's office late at night. Images that hinted at an affair long before the marriage vows were ever spoken. Selina denied them, of course. She called them fabrications, but the damage was done. Sponsors pulled out. Supporters distanced themselves. The gala was remembered not for charity, but for scandal. And Amara, she never appeared. Not once. Not a word from her lips. Her power was in her absence. Kelvin watched her with awe and unease. "You're tearing them apart," he whispered one evening as she stared out the window, her face lit by the faint glow of the city. Amara did not answer. Her silence said enough. But inside, a storm churned. Each victory tasted sweet, yet it did not soften her pain. It deepened it. The more she pulled their world apart, the more she wondered, would it ever be enough? Would she ever feel whole again? Or was she becoming something else entirely, someone who lived only to watch them fall? And so I ask you, watching now, when revenge begins to taste like justice, how do you know when to stop? Or do you stop at all? If you were Amara, would you reveal yourself now, letting them know who is behind their downfall? Or would you keep striking from the shadows until nothing of their world remained? Comment below. I want to see how far you would go. Daniel's confidence, once his greatest armor, began to erode. At first he dismissed the setbacks as bad luck, a deal falling apart, a sponsor withdrawing, a whisper in a boardroom. But soon, the coincidences piled too high to ignore. Selina noticed the change in him, the late nights pacing, the sharp outbursts, the way his phone never left his hand, as if he were waiting for the next blow. "What are you hiding from me, Daniel?" she asked one night, her tone sharper than the jeweled rings on her fingers. "Nothing," he snapped back, but his voice betrayed him. In truth, Daniel had begun to suspect. Somewhere, someone had their hands on the strings of his life, pulling them with precision. Someone who knew too much. But who? His enemies were many. Business rivals, former partners, even old friends he had wronged. But this felt different. This was not random sabotage. It was personal. Each strike landed too perfectly, too close to the heart. Selina, too, began to feel the cracks. Her name, once whispered with admiration, was now tangled with ridicule. Invitations that once came in floods now arrived in trickles. Even her closest circle avoided her eyes, as though they knew something she did not. And at night, when the house grew quiet, she thought of Amara, the woman she had betrayed, the woman whose place she had stolen, the woman who had walked away in silence. "Do you think she could be behind this?" Selina asked once, her voice trembling. Daniel turned sharply. "Amara? She's finished. She has no power." But even as he spoke the words, he felt the lie. Because somewhere deep in his chest, he knew. Amara had always been clever, patient, stronger than she looked. If anyone could strike from the shadows, it was her. And so the paranoia began. Daniel hired private investigators. He sifted through his accounts. He monitored calls, checked emails, traced messages. But Amara was a ghost. Her hands left no fingerprints, her presence no trace. And the more he searched, the more the walls closed in. Investors demanded answers he could not give. Friends withdrew support. Lawsuits circled like vultures, sensing weakness. Selina watched her empire crumble, brick by brick, and turned her fear into anger. "If this is her doing," she hissed, "then she won't stop until we're ruined." But neither of them realized that was exactly the point. And Amara, She remained silent. She never gloated, never revealed her hand. She let their own fear destroy them more thoroughly than she ever could. Tell me, listening now, what is more powerful, the strike that wounds the flesh, or the silence that poisons the mind? I need to know. If you were in Daniel's position, would you confront Amara directly, or would you continue searching in the dark, trying to catch a ghost? Share your thoughts. Your answer might reveal more about you than you think. The cracks had become canyons. Daniel, once untouchable, now clung to scraps of dignity. Selina, who once basked in admiration, found herself whispered about in shame. Their world was collapsing, yet they could not see the hands dismantling it. And so, desperation took root. One evening, long after midnight, Daniel sat in his office, papers scattered like the ruins of an empire. His shirt clung to him, damp with sweat. A single lamp burned, casting shadows across his face, shadows that made him look older, beaten, stripped of the arrogance he once wore so proudly. Selina entered quietly, barefoot, her eyes sunken from sleepless nights. "Daniel," she whispered, "this won't end unless we end it." He looked up at her, hollow-eyed. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," she said firmly, her voice trembling beneath its own weight. "Amara." At the sound of her name, silence fell. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Daniel exhaled. "And how do you suggest we do that?" "She's invisible. Every time I reach for her, there's nothing there." Selina moved closer, her words sharp. "Then we force her into the light. If she wants to play from the shadows, we drag her out." And so the plan was born. Daniel called in favors. He pulled strings that were frayed but still strong enough to hold. He ordered searches. He offered rewards. And finally, through a trail of whispers and debts, they found her. Amara, living quietly on the edge of the city. No spotlight, no extravagance. Just a small house, a modest life, and a silence that concealed more power than all their riches combined. Daniel and Selina sat together in their car one night, parked across the street from that quiet house. The engine was off. The air was heavy. "There she is," Daniel muttered, his jaw clenched. Through the window they could see her silhouette. She moved with calm, unhurried grace. A woman untouched by the chaos she had unleashed. Selina's hand tightened around Daniel's. "This ends tonight," she said, her voice shaking. But what neither of them realized was that Amara had been waiting for this moment. For weeks she had anticipated their desperation. She had laid the path. Every step they took brought them closer to the trap she had set. So when Daniel stepped out of the car, his rage boiling, and Selina followed close behind, they were not hunting Amara. They were walking straight into her hands. And here's the haunting truth. Sometimes revenge is not about the strike itself, but about leading your enemies to destroy themselves. If you were Amara, would you face Daniel and Selina head-on tonight, or would you let their own fear consume them without ever showing your face? Tell me, because the choice you make reveals how you see power. The house on the edge of the city. The night was thick. A moonless sky pressed down on the quiet street, where even the crickets seemed hesitant to sing. The hum of the city felt distant here, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to belong only to her, to Amara. Daniel stood by the car door, his breath ragged, his fists clenched. Every nerve in his body screamed for action, but something inside whispered caution. Selina gripped his arm tightly. "Do you feel it?" she asked softly. "What?" he muttered, his eyes fixed on the small house across the road. "The quiet. It's too quiet." And she was right. It wasn't the natural quiet of a sleeping neighborhood. It was the kind that feels staged, as though the silence itself were waiting. Still, they pressed on. They crossed the street slowly, their footsteps crunching faintly against the gravel. The curtains of the house were drawn, but faint light spilled through the edges. A lamp, perhaps, or candles. Daniel's chest heaved as they reached the front door. He raised his hand to knock, but paused, because just then the door creaked open. Neither of them had touched it. The air shifted, and there she stood. Amara clothed simply, her face calm, her eyes unreadable. She did not look surprised. She did not even look concerned. She looked as though she had been waiting all along. "Daniel, Selina." Her voice was quiet, steady. Finally. Selina's breath caught in her throat. Daniel's jaw tightened. "You've been destroying us," he growled, piece by piece, "but it ends tonight." Amara tilted her head slightly, studying them, and then with a faint smile she stepped aside. "Then come in." They hesitated. Every instinct screamed at them not to cross that threshold, and yet, pride, anger, desperation, it pushed them forward. The door shut behind them with a soft click. Inside, the house was sparse, almost bare, a single table, 2 chairs, a lamp glowing faintly in the corner. Nothing else. Amara gestured to the chairs. "Sit." But they didn't move. Daniel's voice broke the silence. "You ruined everything we built. You humiliated us. "I did nothing you didn't hand to me yourselves," she interrupted calmly. "Your empire crumbled because it was built on arrogance and greed. All I did was show people the truth." Selina snapped, her voice sharp. "You planned this, every step. You waited for the moment we'd be vulnerable." Amara's eyes finally met hers, and for the first time there was something, a flicker of fire. "No, you made yourselves vulnerable. I simply allowed the light in." Daniel stepped forward, rage bubbling. "Enough of your riddles," his voice cracked in the hollow room. "Tell me why. Why us?" Amara leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on his. Her answer was quiet, but heavy. "Because betrayal always comes full circle." The words struck like thunder in silence, and in that moment, Daniel felt something he had never felt before. Fear, not of Amara herself, but of the mirror she held up to him. The trap was not in her house. It was in their own choices. And the cruelest truth? The confrontation they longed for was not their victory. It was her final victory, because by standing in that room, by seeking her out, they had already surrendered. If you were Daniel and Selina, would you have walked into that house, or would you have turned away at the door? Comment below, because sometimes survival depends not on fighting, but on knowing when to walk away. The silence inside the house stretched until it became unbearable. Daniel's breathing grew heavier, his fists curling tighter with each second that passed. Selina's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything, a weapon, a weakness, an escape. But the room was deliberately bare. It wasn't a home. It was a stage. Amara stood between them and the lamp in the corner, her figure half shrouded in shadow. Her calm unnerved them more than rage ever could. "Do you remember?" she said softly, her voice carrying like a thread through the stillness. "The night of your engagement party?" Daniel's body stiffened. Selina turned sharply toward him, her eyes narrowing. "How do you know about that?" Selina demanded. Amara ignored her. Her gaze was fixed on Daniel. "You gave a speech that night," she continued. "You spoke of loyalty, of trust, of building a life where no one could touch what was yours." Daniel's lips parted slightly. The exact words returned to him, words he had spoken years ago, now turned into a blade. Amara took a step closer. "But when the music ended, and the guests went home, you weren't with Selina, were you?" Selina's face drained of color. Her voice trembled. "What is she talking about, Daniel?" He swallowed hard, his chest tightening. His silence was louder than any confession. Amara's tone never rose, never faltered. "The pattern began long before tonight, before your empire, before the collapse. You thought your secrets would stay buried, but the ground has a way of giving them up, when it's soaked long enough with betrayal. Selina stumbled back, shaking her head. No, no, you're lying. But Amara's eyes pierced through her denial. And you, Selina, do you think you're untouched? Do you remember the villa on the outskirts of town, the nights you claimed to be traveling for charity work? Selina froze. Daniel turned to her, his jaw slack with shock. What villa? His voice broke. She couldn't speak. Amara's lips curved into the faintest smile, not of joy, but of finality. You see, she whispered, you destroyed each other long before I arrived. I didn't need to take your empire. I only needed to show you who you truly are. And now, here you stand, broken, exposed, exactly where you led yourselves. Daniel's hands shook violently, torn between rage and despair. He looked at Selina, searching for denial, for explanation, but found only silence. The room seemed to shrink around them, suffocating, until the truth was all that remained. And in that moment, Daniel and Selina realized the most chilling truth of all. Amara wasn't their destroyer. She was their reflection. The walls of their empire had fallen, but not because someone pushed them. They had rotted from within, and Amara merely pulled away the curtain. The trap had never been her house. The trap was themselves. If Amara were standing before you, peeling back your darkest secrets one by one, what truth would you pray she never spoke aloud? Comment below, because sometimes the real enemy isn't the one in front of us, but the one we hide within ourselves. The room was heavy with silence, a silence so sharp it cut deeper than any words. Daniel's chest rose and fell, his breaths uneven, his face damp with sweat. Selina stood rigid, trembling, her fingers clutching at the edge of her dress as though holding fabric could keep her from collapsing. Amara did not move quickly. She didn't need to. She glided a step to the left, her eyes never leaving them, her presence swallowing the room whole. You both thought, she said quietly, that your empire was made of stone. But stone is brittle when the foundation is nothing but lies. Daniel's head jerked up, his voice cracked with rage. What do you want from us? Amara tilted her head, almost amused by the question. Want? Her whisper was so low, it forced them to lean closer to hear. You think I came for money, for control? No, Daniel, I came for the truth, and the truth is what destroys you far more than I ever could. Selina's eyes darted wildly, looking for something, an opening, a chance to run, but every corner of the room seemed to collapse in on itself. Amara's gaze turned on her. Tell him, Selina. Tell him who else was there in that villa. Tell him what you traded not for love, but for survival. Selina's breath hitched, her lips parted, but no words came out. Her silence screamed louder than a confession. Daniel's fists clenched until his knuckles blanched. You're lying, he shouted, but his voice trembled too much to carry conviction. Amara's tone never wavered. Am I? She walked slowly toward the lamp, brushing her hand against the shade until the light shifted, casting long shadows across their faces. Every empire has cracks. Yours was always built to collapse. You were just too blind, too arrogant to see it. Selina broke first. Her knees gave way, and she sank to the floor, covering her face with her hands. A sob tore through her, raw and unrestrained, as if the weight of years finally crushed her in that single instant. Daniel staggered back, as though her collapse dragged him with it. His voice was hoarse now, stripped of all the authority he once carried. What do you want from us? He whispered again, but this time it was not rage, it was desperation. Amara looked down at them both, her figure towering, shadowed, inescapable. Her silence lasted long enough that the air itself seemed to freeze. Finally, she spoke, slowly, deliberately. I already have what I want. You, broken, exposed. The empire you worshipped is dust, and the bond you pretended to honor is ash. There is nothing left for me to take. She leaned forward just enough that they could see the calm certainty in her eyes. The rest she whispered, is yours to destroy. And with that, she turned away, leaving them in the hollow wreckage of their own making. The room did not need fire or violence. Its silence was enough, and so Daniel and Selina were left with the cruelest punishment of all, not ruin at the hands of another, but ruin at their own. Amara had pulled no weapon, spilled no blood, yet she had left them shattered in a way no blade ever could, because sometimes the most devastating revenge is not to end someone's life, but to let them live with the truth. If you were in Daniel's position and the person you trusted most was exposed before your eyes, would you fight to forgive, or would you let the empire burn? Tell me in the comments below, and if you've made it this far into the story, don't just watch in silence, subscribe now, because the next story might expose a truth you've been trying to hide. Daniel could not sit still any longer. His chest heaved, his fists slammed against the glass table, sending it rattling across the polished floor. "You don't get to walk in here, Amara," he shouted, his voice breaking. "You don't get to tear everything apart. This is my house, my life, my—" But his words cut short when Amara turned her head ever so slightly, her gaze slicing through him like cold steel. She didn't raise her voice, didn't flinch, yet Daniel stumbled back as though struck. "This was never your life," she said softly, her words more lethal than a blade. "It was a performance. And tonight, the curtain falls." Selina trembled on the floor, her sobs raw and unrestrained. She looked up at Daniel, searching for some fragment of the man she once thought she loved. But what she saw was not a protector, not a husband, not even a partner. What she saw was a man cornered, and cornered men are the most dangerous. "Selina," Amara's voice lowered, almost tender, though the edge beneath it never softened. "You know what he will do now. He will blame you. He will try to bury his shame in your silence. But silence is what destroyed you both." Selina shook her head violently, her hair falling into her face. "No, please, stop." Amara's eyes narrowed. "Then tell him. Tell him what he refuses to hear. Tell him the truth." For a moment the room froze. Daniel's jaw tightened, his fists clenched again, and the veins in his temple throbbed with fury. Selina's lips quivered. She opened her mouth, and the words slipped out, weak but undeniable. "It wasn't just me, Daniel." Daniel's head snapped toward her, his eyes widened, confusion turning to shock and then to rage. "What?" he hissed. Tears streamed down Selina's cheeks as her voice broke apart. "It wasn't just me. You think you were the only one betrayed? You weren't the only one lied to." The confession hung in the air like a knife suspended by a thread. Amara's smile was faint, but it was there. She stepped back, her shadow stretching across the wall, letting the silence drag like a blade against their skin. Daniel's face twisted, every ounce of control he once carried dissolving before their eyes. He staggered closer to Selina, his voice shaking with fury. "What are you saying?" Selina buried her face in her hands, unable to meet his gaze. "I'm saying, you never knew the whole story, and you never wanted to." Daniel's roar filled the room, guttural, broken. He kicked the table, sending glass shattering across the floor. His anger was no longer power, it was desperation. A man stripped bare with nothing left to hide behind. Amara didn't move. She didn't need to. She watched as the two of them unraveled, their empire of lies collapsing piece by piece. And then, with chilling calm, she spoke the final words that sealed their fate. "Now you see. It was never me who destroyed you. It was always you." The silence that followed was unbearable, and in that silence, Daniel and Selina stood at the edge of their own ruin, broken, exposed, alone. Amara hadn't come to end them with fire or fury. She had simply turned the mirror and let them destroy themselves, because sometimes the cruelest punishment is not death. It is living, with the truth you cannot escape. Viewers, if you were in Selina's place, knowing Daniel's rage could crush you, would you reveal the full truth, or would you take it to your grave? Comment below. And if you want more stories that unravel like this one, subscribe right now, because the next tale may be darker than you think. Daniel's chest rose and fell in ragged bursts. His face, once composed and full of charm, was now twisted into something unrecognizable, the mask gone, the raw ugliness of his rage fully exposed. He lunged forward, grabbing Selina by the arm so tightly she cried out. "What truth?" he barked, his spit flying. "What else have you hidden from me?" Selina struggled, but her voice was barely audible. "Let me go. Daniel, please." But he wouldn't release her. His eyes were bloodshot, his grip unrelenting. This wasn't a husband asking questions. This was a man clinging to the last shred of control, terrified that the walls were caving in on him. Amara's steps were slow, measured, deliberate. Her heels echoed across the cold marble floor as she moved closer. She didn't raise a hand, didn't intervene physically. She didn't need to. Her voice was enough. "Look at yourself, Daniel," she said, her tone cold and sharp. "This is who you've always been. You built a life on power, on lies, on appearances, and now, even as it burns, you can't stop clawing at the ashes." Daniel turned on her, releasing Selina so violently that she stumbled backward. He pointed a trembling finger toward Amara, his voice cracking with fury. "You think you're righteous? You think you're better than us? You came here to destroy me, Amara. Admit it." Amara tilted her head, her eyes locked on his, unblinking. "No, Daniel, I didn't destroy you. I revealed you. And the world sees what I've always known." Selina whimpered, clutching her chest, her breaths uneven. Her confession hung heavy between them, incomplete, but damning enough. She sank into the corner, whispering to herself like a broken record. Daniel's rage faltered for just a second, replaced by something far more dangerous. Despair. His voice lowered, hoarse, almost a whisper. "If I lose her, if I lose everything, then what's left of me?" The room froze. That question wasn't for Amara. It wasn't for Selina. It was for himself. A man staring into the void of his own making. But Amara didn't offer him comfort. She leaned closer, her shadow stretching across him. "What's left, Daniel? Nothing but the man you've been hiding from your whole life," Daniel snapped. His roar filled the room as he grabbed a chair and hurled it against the wall, the wood splintering, the sound reverberating like thunder. Selina screamed, curling tighter into herself. The mansion seemed to tremble with his fury, yet Amara never flinched. She stood tall, unmoved, her calm a weapon sharper than his violence. Finally, Daniel dropped to his knees, clutching his head in his hands. His voice broke, jagged with pain. It wasn't supposed to end like this. And in that moment, the image of power he had crafted for years lay shattered before them all. Amara whispered the final words, barely audible yet cutting deep. "It never ends the way liars imagine. It ends the way truth demands." The silence that followed was deafening. And so the house that Daniel built, the house of appearances, control, and deception, fell in one night. Not by fire, not by blood, but by truth. Selina, broken yet free. Daniel, ruined by his own fury. And Amara, walking away without lifting a hand. Because the greatest punishments are the ones we deliver to ourselves. If you were in Amara's shoes, would you have walked away after exposing the truth? Or would you have stayed to finish what you started? Tell me in the comments. And don't forget, every story here hides another waiting to be revealed. Subscribe now, because the next betrayal might shake you even deeper.